Well, I've sort of advertised today's talk with a provocative statement: "Beware the Ides of March." Now, the Ides of a month is smack dab in the middle, so usually the 15th day of the month is called the Ides of March, and it happened to be the assassination date, as much as anybody can tell, of Julius Caesar, who was, it was a political assassination, of course, but he was getting ready to assume dictatorial powers that even exceeded his dictatorial powers that was granted him by the Roman Senate. He was getting ready to turn himself into an emperor or a king. And in the famous Shakespeare play, Julius Caesar, they had it dramatized that a soothsayer told him, prophesied to beware the Ides of March, as he must have gotten wind that the assassination plot was going to happen. And in the play, Julius Caesar shows up at the Senate, and he sees the soothsayer out in the audience, and he says, "Hey, look, you're wrong. The Ides of March are already here, and here I am." And he says, "The Ides of March have come." And soothsayer says something like, "Yeah, but it's not over yet, kid." And, anyway, so I'm not here to talk this morning about the assassination of Julius Caesar, but because it's the Ides of March, and I'm always scrambling for a segue for our conversation, it occurred to me that there was another famous and significant world-changing, formula-changing assassination event that also happened in March of I think 415 AD, and that's the assassination of Hypatia of Alexandria. And I regret I haven't seen the movie, or one of the movies that feature her life. But I wrote a little something about it because I think it was a very significant event in the world of human thought and spirituality, which I'm going to read in a second. But I also I wrote something, I think, in 1996, which I'm going to read. But more recently, in 2019, there was a wonderful, wonderful article, which I'm only going to read the first paragraph of, really, that was published in Laphan's Quarterly. And it's the round table, "The Killing of Hypatia," and by Soraya Field Fiorio. So I'm going to read her January 2019 article. But before I do, I'd like to point out that something that you already know, or you should know. We're living in very freaky, freaky times. And there's many parallels to both the world of Hypatia in 415 and of Julius Caesar in, I don't know what, very early AD. And that is the rise of irrational, authoritarian, unstable governments and leadership, and the fact that a certain madness is seems to be taking over. When I was a kid, they would call it mass hysteria. When I'd ask my dad about, well, gee, how did Hitler take over, and how did Mussolini and Hitler take over? And it was like a democracy. The democracy brought them to power. And my dad always said it was a form of mass hysteria. Okay, I sense this mass hysteria happening every time I watch the evening news, when I see congressmen, congresswomen, senators, people in charge saying things that are pure madness, a complete disconnect from reality. And then I see the madness of the supporters that believe everything from Bobby Kennedy coming back to life to, and I see it on the comedy shows. They interview people at these rallies, people who vote, people who buy stuff, saying absolute crazy, crazy, mad things. And that seems to be on the rise. And rational people that would attempt to have a conversation with people like this are completely helpless. Something that, but anyway, I'm digressing here, but I see certain parallels, and these parallels do not paint a very optimistic picture of what is unfolding for us here in the next, in the foreseeable future, especially with the environment falling apart and the instability of governments and military operations and things like that. So I don't want to be a downer today, but I do want to talk about something that we should be thinking about. Back in 1967, shortly after Martin Luther King was assassinated, shortly after in April, and Bobby Kennedy in June, and the Vietnam War happening, and all of that going on, we were pretty much convinced that the world was going to hell in a handbasket, and we decided to drop out of the whole scene and move to southern Oregon, get off the grid, and that our only escape wasn't going to be military. Our escape wasn't going to be physical. The only escape for the madness that was happening was going to be our own enlightenment. So we moved to Southern Oregon, not so much to be survivalists, but to quickly gain enlightenment as our only escape from the madness around us. And although that was pretty juvenile and immature thing to think of, it was true. and it's always been true. Our only remedy for any of the madness that's surrounding us is our own centered enlightenment. So, that being said, let's talk about Hypatia. Here's what Soraya Field Fiorio says in a 2019 article. One early spring day during the year 415 in the city of Alexandria, the intellectual heart of the waning Roman Empire, the pagan philosopher Hypatia was murdered by a mob of Christian men. These men, the Parabolani, were a volunteer militia of monks serving as henchmen to the archbishop. Their conscripted purpose was to aid the dead and dying, but they could be more readily found terrorizing Christian groups and terrorizing opposing Christian groups, and there were a million of them and leveling pagan temples. At the urging of Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria. Now, Cyril is a saint now, okay? He invented and pushed through the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, okay? Cyril was a bigwig. At the urging of Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria, they had already destroyed the remains of the Library of Alexandria. Well, it had caught on fire and was sustained major damage when Rome, it's all in the movie Cleopatra, Roman ships in the harbor caught fire, etc. But I digress. The Parabolani razed pagan temples, attacked the Jewish quarters, and defiled masterpieces of ancient art they considered demonic by mutilating statues and melting them down for gold. They now set their gaze on the city's beloved teacher of mathematics and philosophy, whose social ranking was on par with Alexandria's most important men. Understanding nothing of her philosophy, they called her a witch. Are you surprised? They pulled the elderly teacher from her chariot as she rode through the city and dragged her to a temple. She was stripped naked, her skin flayed with jagged pieces of oyster shells. Remember, she's like in her 60s, okay? And pretty elderly gal, okay? Her skin flayed with jagged pieces of oyster shells, her limbs pulled from her body and paraded through the streets. Her remains were burned in a mockery of pagan sacrifice. Hypatia's death marked the end of paganism and the triumph of Christianity, the final act of a 100-year-old feud waged by the new religion against the ancient world. Oh, that's all. She was born in 355, etc., etc. Well, maybe I'll cover that in my little talk. Anyway, that's Hypatia. Now, it was more than Bishop Cyril's private army of Proud Boys that it was also a church group of Peter the Reader out in the desert that joined with them. I guess 1%. Anyway, here's what I wrote in 1996, a decade or so before, in a chapter or an article or a section of the book called Rebels and Devils, which is an anthology of wild things. Anyway, it's called Devil Be My God. I've read it before, but you're going to hear it again. And I start off with a quote from the movie Robin Hood, where the Bishop of Black Cannons is talking with Robin Hood, and he said, I advise you to curb that wagging tongue of yours. And Robin Hood said, it's a habit I've never formed, Your Grace. In AD 415, Cyril, the Bishop of Alexandria, Egypt, found himself in the most awkward position. Not only was he burdened with the task of concocting viable doctrines, and that's the Holy Trinity, of concocting viable doctrines from the muddled and conflicting traditions of the young Christian cult, he was required to do so in the most sophisticated and enlightened pagan city on earth. Now, I got to digress for a second. When they say pagan here, not only do they include the rustic, nature honoring religions of the countryside and the rural areas. When they're talking about pagan here, they're talking about all things intellectual, all things ancient and classical. So mathematics, astronomy, medicine, all of that was considered pagan if it was not Christian. And part of this high echelon of intellectual giants, at the very top of that was the mathematician Theon. And well, I'll get it. And Hypatia was Theon's daughter. Okay. He was required to do so in the most sophisticated and enlightened pagan city on earth. Long before the alleged virgin birth of the crucified Savior, Alexandria, with her celebrated schools and libraries, nurtured the greatest minds of the Mediterranean world and Asia. Here, religion and philosophy were lovers, and their union gave rise to a dynamic environment of dialogue and debate. On more than one occasion, Cyril tried to glean converts from the student body of the Neoplatonic Academy, only to be struck dumb by the discomforting realization that the fledgling philosophers were far more knowledgeable than he about the subtleties and shortcomings of his own faith. Uncomfortable as such moments were, His Grace bore them dutifully. They afforded him the opportunity to suffer for his faith. His patience came to an end, however, when his faith and reputation were challenged by a brilliant and charismatic luminary of the Alexandrian school of Neoplatonism, Hypatia, the greatest woman initiate of the ancient world. Hypatia of Alexandria was without question the most respected and influential thinker of her day. The daughter of the great mathematician Theon, she took over her father's honored position at the academy and lectured there for many years. She, more than any other individual since Plotinus, the father of Neoplatonism, grasped the profound potential of that school of thought. Her lectures were wildly popular and attracted streams of scholars who saw in Neoplatonism the possibility of a truly universal spiritual order, a supreme philosophy, an enlightened religion to unite all religions. Such was the golden promise of Neoplatonism, and Hypatia of Alexandria was its virgin prophetess. Troubled by the continued degeneration of the Christian movement, its intolerance of other faiths, its dangerous preoccupation with miracles and wonders, Hypatia began a series of public lectures dealing with the cult. She revealed the pagan roots of the faith and systematically unmasked the absurdities and superstitions that infected the movement. Then, with power and eloquence surpassing that of any Christian apologist, she elucidated upon what she understood to be the true spiritual treasures found in the purported teachings of the Christ. Her arguments were so persuasive that many of the new converts to the cult renounced their conversions and became disciples of Hypatia. Her lectures stimulated enormous interest in Christianity, but not the Christianity that was presented by Cyril, the bishop of Alexandria. Not blessed with the strength of character necessary to suffer a personal confrontation with Hypatia, Cyril embarked upon a campaign of personal vilification by preaching to his unwashed and fanatical flock. Now, I'm not saying that just to be mean. It was an unwashed flock because washing and bathing was considered evil and vain and satanic. The more the Christian cult stunk, the more pious they pretended to be. And they hated anyone that smelled good. They called them woke. Preaching to his unwashed and fanatical crowd, he preached that Hypatia was a menace to the faith, a sorceress in league with the devil. These diatribes seemed to have little effect upon the sophisticated population of urban Alexandria, who were beginning to realize that Bishop Cyril's Christianity was a cult that didn't play well with other children. Deep in the Nitrian desert, however, Cyril's hateful words eventually reached the crude monastery of Peter the Reader. That was his nickname. Years of preaching to the wind and converting scorpions had uniquely qualified Peter to be the cleansing sword of the Prince of Peace, and the thought of a devil-possessed woman attacking his Savior was more than this man of God could stomach. Mustering a ragtag collection of fellow hermits, he marched to Alexandria, where they met with officials of the Caesarean Church, who informed them that each afternoon the shameless Hypatia drove her own chariot. She drove her own chariot from the academy to her home. armed only with clubs, oyster shells, and the grace of God, Peter and his mob joined with the Parabanani, Cyril's own Proud Boys, joined with them and they ambushed Hypatia in the street near the academy, pulling her from her chariot. They dragged her to the Caesarean church, where they stripped her, beat her with clubs, and finally, because of an ongoing debate about the soul's eternal salvation, if the corpse remained whole, they scraped the flesh from her bones with oyster shells. The scoops of flesh and the rest of her remains were then carried away and burned. The reaction of the Alexandrian community was one of confusion and shock. They were literally paralyzed. And the Neoplatonist school was dealt a blow from which it never recovered. Although he went to great lengths to distance himself from the incident, Cyril took full advantage of the situation and used the terror of the moment to further intimidate the city and establish that the will of the Christian God was to be resisted at one's own risk. The martyrdom of Hypatia was certainly not the first example of truth resisting evil and losing. But it did mark the beginning of a prolonged spiritual delirium tremor from which Western civilization has never fully recovered. And even the bright souls who did not succumb to the universal madness were forced to blossom against the twisted projections of a collective nightmare. And I'm starting to see the twisted projections of a collective nightmare at work, not only here in the United States, but in Europe, the Far East, in Africa. Spiritual growth is not impossible in such an environment. But where wisdom is perceived by the world to be ignorance, love is considered sin. And all that is best in the human spirit is condemned and repressed. In times like these, the road by which a seeker of enlightenment must travel takes many curious turns. On such a journey, one's companions are outlaws and rebels. Sacredness breeds in blasphemy. Truth falls from the lips of false prophets. Heaven is sought in hell. And God is the devil himself. Beware the Ides of March. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will.